Hello, welcome to the Scrum. I'm James Carden. Today, I am very pleased to welcome the author and journalist, Molly McCartney. Molly's career as a reporter spanned over 30 years at 5 newspapers, including 10 years at the Miami Herald and 15 at the Washington Post, where she wrote under the byline Molly Sinclair. She was a Wilson Center Public Policy Scholar in 2012. She holds a degree in liberal studies from Georgetown and received a prestigious Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University. Our discussion today will mostly revolve around what I and many consider to be the best account of the US military industrial complex of the past several decades. The book, America's War Machine, was written by Molly and her late husband, the longtime Washington correspondent, James McCartney. And it received widely positive notice when it was released. Library Journal called it a sobering yet essential account of the defense industry. It is a book for anyone curious about the evolution and influence of our contemporary military industrial complex. The former national security correspondent for the Washington Post, Thomas W. Lippman, said of America's War Machine that, quote, "Nobody knew the inside of the great Washington machine better than Jim McCartney. His knowledge, fortified by the perceptive reporting and graceful, sensitive writing of Molly Sinclair McCartney, makes a compelling combination and an essential book." Molly also serves on the board of the Committee for the Republic, one of Washington's most important and innovative organizations, which seeks to restore sanity and, above all, the role of the US Constitution into the American foreign policy making process. And we'll talk about that a bit later on. So, Molly, thanks so much for joining us. In the prologue to America's War Machine, James writes that his combat experience while serving in the infantry from November 1944 to March 1945 was the beginning of a lifelong journey to understand war and the American war machine that has evolved since World War II. So what was the impetus for this particular book? And can you tell us how you went about carrying on the project to its fruition?
Great question. In his retirement from daily journalism, but not from column writing and keeping up with the news, making speeches, Jim had time to reflect on his life experience as a reporter, in addition to his World War II service in France and Germany, but as a reporter covering national security in Washington, D.C., and from about 30 countries, including Vietnam, the Middle East, Russia, Egypt, and so on. When we moved to Florida to retire in 2000, the year 2000, the local library immediately recruited Jim as a speaker. This was a smart move because he was a great speaker. He was terrific with an ability to weave his own personal experiences in and do it in a way that the people found very compelling. They had a room at the library that would hold about 50 people. And because they had more people than that who wanted to hear him, they would schedule him for morning and afternoon sessions. So he'd do 50 in the morning and 50 in the afternoon. This was happening about the time that we began to hear the Bush White House talk about invading Iraq. So that added to people's interest in national security and how it worked. And at the end of his presentation, people would say, well, you need to write a book because we had no idea that this was how the system worked. We didn't understand it, and you've explained it now, and we really think you need to do a book. So he started seriously then thinking how to do a book. How would you put it together in a way that would be meaningful and that would capture not only what he knew, but all of the things that he had learned in his many years of reporting. So that was the framework. And he began with the idea of an opening chapter, which really laid out his vision very effectively for what the book would be about. And that is pretty much verbatim in the book in the very beginning, because it just really explains what he's doing, why he's doing it, why he cares about it, why it's important. He also made a list of chapters and he began to write those chapters. He was basing a lot of these on things that he had already written, things that he talked about. So he loved to talk about his work. I loved to listen. By the time he started working on the book, I felt like I had a graduate degree in national security because I was hearing this 24/7 for more than 25 years and came away knowing a lot more than I had in the beginning. So I should also mention that I was doing the graphics for those talks in terms of creating slides that we could use as part of his presentation to also help drive this home. Now, he died in May of 2011, and he left in this very unfinished manuscript and notes. But again, at the memorial service in Florida, the woman from the library came over to me and said, "What's going to happen to Jim's book?" And I said, I have no idea. Talk to me later. She said, "You've got to finish that book. It's too important to just let it stop." So I understood what she was saying. It took me a while to sort of get my focus back. But when I did, the first thing I did was go to Jim's son, Bob McCartney. He's a Washington Post reporter. Bob had been a foreign correspondent in Central America in the 80s, covering the wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua. He was then in Eastern Europe and Bonn, Germany, covering the protests leading up to the fall of Berlin Wall. And he was in constant touch with his father all those years. And I said, "This is what Jim left. Can you finish the book? Because you're better positioned to do it than I am." And he looked at it. He said, "I can't do this in my day job." So I said, "All right, I will do it, but you have to backstop me." And he said, "No problem." So he was a backstop along with a lot of other people who were experts in the area. And I also felt like I had to have a little more credibility in terms of, was the premise solid? Jim called this book America's War Machine. That is unsettling to people. Right. And I thought, I need to know more than just him. It's like the newsroom where they say, "I don't care who told you that. I don't care if your mother told you, you better check it out." So I went to Jim's bureau chief, Bob Boyd, and said, "Okay, Bob, here's what he left. Is the premise solid? Is there enough here? Is there enough meat here for a book if I go forward with this?" And he came back and said, "Yes, and yes, you have a lot of work to do because there's so much more that needs to be investigated, researched, so forth and so on." That's when I applied for the Wilson Center Public Policy, which they gave me in 2012. And I developed the manuscript. I did find an editor who could sort of go through the material with me, backstop it. I found an agent who immediately sold this to St. Martin's Press. I was very surprised at how quickly it sold. It came out in 2015. And then I knew I would also have to actually promote the book because the publishers don't really do very much. So I did book talks, I did television interviews. I went everywhere I had a friend who had any kind of audience and got the book out.
Well, it's quite a journey.
It was quite a journey.
Yeah,
it continues.
We should probably turn to then to the book itself, and one of the main questions that the book sets out to answer is why does the American military budget continue at near record levels? According to the book, U.S. defense spending averages 20 to 30% more than it did during the Cold War. As you put it in the book, we are building weapons to fight enemies that don't exist. Can you talk about the forces that drive the spending? Is the current demonization of Russia and China also not an effort to keep the money flowing to this war machine?
So that's two questions. So let's start with the question of the forces. And actually, it all comes down to money. The military budget is a honeypot for people who want to make money, the people who are the defense contractors and other people who benefit from the threat of war, the fear of enemies like Russia and China, and also the threat of terrorism. All of that makes people scared, and it leads to a tremendous amount of spending on defense, some of it badly spent. You may remember that in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was great hope that we would have a peace dividend, that there would a way to siphon money from the Pentagon into education, healthcare, even infrastructure. Never happened. Because the forces of the people who benefit from the system were able to find ways to continue the spending. I love one of there were some great quotes out of that. Irving Kristol, who was one of the leading conservatives talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, he said, this has deprived us of an enemy. And then he said, quote, in politics, being deprived of an enemy is a very serious matter. You tend to get relaxed and dispirited. That was Irving Kristol. Colin Powell was even more precise. He was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he told the Army Times in an interview, think about it. I'm running out of demons. I'm down to Fidel Castro and Kim Il-sung. So what we had instead of a peace dividend was a continuation of spending. Yeah. Because those people, along with their friends in Congress, basically found ways to justify weapons and spending. Nothing changed really. But then you get 9/11 and you get an explosion of spending. Congress could not pour enough money into the military industrial complex. They just couldn't get money there quick enough, fast enough. It was just, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the peace dividend. One of your fellow board members on the Committee for the Republic, Del Spurlock, actually drew up the actual plans to realize a peace dividend back then. And there's some fascinating history as to who was behind stopping him from doing that. And my understanding is that Defense Secretary Cheney's office had quite a bit to do with scuttling those plans. No surprise there. But yeah. You bring up then the wars that happened in the post 9/11 period, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and these also relied heavily on private contractors, which is a topic that America's War Machine covers quite well. Indeed, as a report in the Christian Science Monitor pointed out in 2012, the degree of privatization is unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. So that's another topic that you and James covered in the book. Can you talk a little bit about the role defense contractors play, not only in keeping us on a permanent war footing, but the role it also plays in selling arms to some of the most odious regimes on the planet?
Well, let's talk about the contractors first. They are an even bigger part of the military operations today than when the book came out 5 years ago. I looked this up in anticipation of this question and found that there's a new study by Boston University and Brown University reporting that there were 53,000 US contractors in the Middle East last year compared to 35,000 troops. Again, 53,000 contractors, 35,000 troops. Amazing. So 1.5 contractors for each single troop. That is a higher ratio than we had in 2008, when the ratio was 1 contractor per troop. The report also estimated, and this is another sad fact, in this report that Brown and Boston did, they estimated there are about 8,000 contractors for US companies died on duty in the Middle East since 2001. Many of these were foreign nationals who were paid less than US employees. And the author of the study made this point. The use of the contractors, these lesser paid foreign, quote, hides the human cost and makes war more politically palatable because it's not Americans who are dying. Another stunning number in that report said that more than half of last year's defense budget was spent on contractor services and weapons. In other words, of about $700 billion budget for defense, about $370 billion went into the contracting pocket. This kind of use of the contractor started back in the Clinton administration, but then it dramatically increased with 9/11. And of course, this then is a new opportunity for fraud, corruption, shoddy product. There were a lot of stories, particularly in the post-invasion of Iraq, about the way in which one of the companies that I think Cheney had been connected to had overpriced. It was a real expose of everything wrong in the way the contractors were working. Now, in terms of the arms sales, again, a sad story. And what we have, the truth is that the business of selling conventional weapons to other countries is booming in peace-loving America. It's just hard to wrap your head around some of these things. And as you said, this is documented in the books and in reports since then. Cato Institute has done a lot of work on this issue. They have some of the best reporting that has been done on this issue. And I'm going to read you a quote from a 2020 report they did, which makes these points. With few exceptions, the US is ready to sell weapons to any nation with the money to buy them. The risk of arms transfers to bad actors and other negative outcomes continue to make little discernible impact on American decisions about where to sell weapons. Nations involved in disastrous conflicts, nations with ugly human rights records, and countries struggling to manage crime, corruption, and terrorism have all purchased millions of dollars of weapons from the US over the past 2 decades. History suggests that most of these arms sales will do little to improve American security, and that some of the weapons will end up in the wrong hands and be used for the wrong reasons, close quote. Who buys the weapons? Who sells the weapons? Well, big surprise. Lockheed Martin was the largest arms producing company in 2018. Second largest was Boeing, followed by Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, General, the usual
Right.
people.
Suspects. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, in addition to selling to the US, they sell to these other countries. And the biggest customer in the period of 2015 to 2019 was Saudi Arabia. That is the country that murdered Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. They strangled him and hacked him to death because he had raised some questions about the way they were running the country. And they are our biggest customer.
And they had not a peripheral involvement in the events of 9/11.
Right.
So you brought up a Cato Institute report, and Cato Institute is one of the few, whatever you think of libertarianism, it's one of the few
Right.
think tanks in Washington that has been consistently anti-war. And I think that this would be a good segue to talk about the role that other think tanks play in perpetuating America's war machine. The role they play in fomenting not only the post-9/11 war fever over Iraq is well documented in your book. There seems to be an element of pay to play in lobbying, particularly in places like Brookings and the Center for American Progress, which takes loads of money from the Gulf state tyrannies. And then there are the conservative ones that you and James covered very well in your book, think tanks like AEI and the Institute for the Study of War, which have never seen a war they didn't want to send young Americans to die in. So I was wondering if you might talk about, what explains the power and influence of these think tanks in perpetuating the war machine in Washington.
Well, that's one of the more interesting elements about the complex that has evolved since Eisenhower made his speech in 1961. Because at that time, there were only a handful of these think tanks, and they were certainly different, operating differently than they do now. There's a University of Pennsylvania guy who has been tracking the evolution of these think tanks for years. I think he's James McGann. And just so you have some numbers quickly to think about it, it's like 2,200 think tanks in the US, several hundred of them operating in Washington. One of the most respected and top rated consistently is the Brookings Institute. And I have to say the Wilson Center also gets pretty high marks. And of course, that's where I got support to do some of the research for this book. But there are problems with where the money comes from in terms of what happens with the way with the think tank system. And I'm going to say you have to look at where they're getting their money to understand where they are on some issues. Now, I was once told that the system works this way, at least for some of the think tanks. A donor requests a particular study or project on an issue. If the study concludes what the donor wants, the report is released. If the study does not support what the donor wants, it never gets released.
Right.
And I would suspect they go somewhere else until they get a report that says what they want. That's the problem with and that's why it's important to know where the think tanks are getting their money in order to understand what's driving their positions. Some are more extreme than others. Some have more money than others. You had in the run-up to the Iraq War, the American Enterprise Institute had this little arm off, the Project for a New America, which was pushing for an invasion of Iraq as far back as 1998 in letters to Bill Clinton. He ignored them. 8 days after 9/11, they wrote the same letter to George Bush, and guess what? And I would also note the people who signed that letter, many of them by that time were in the Bush government.
Right.
Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, the usual suspects.
Right.
So while the think tanks can certainly play an important role in helping create a body of information about an issue in terms of its history, this pros and cons, all the things you want to know to understand what's happening, it also opens the door for the kind of disinformation we got in the last 4 years, because suddenly you can produce a report that shows whatever you wanted to show.
Right.
And then it gets used in ways that leave the public very confused about what to believe.
And that's what makes a lot of them such dangerous actors.
That's right.
But in Washington, as we know, it's not, though the good actors are far outnumbered by the bad actors. There are some good actors in Washington.
There are good. And there are other good ones too. And I would say one of the most impressive think tank, I'm not even sure you call it a think tank, but it's a program. It's the Cost of War project that Brown University has been working on for a number of years. They pulled in academics from all over the country. This was created by and still run by a couple of women academics who had the foresight to say, we need some numbers other than what government tells us about who's dying and how much is being spent on these wars. And from that, they have made into this wonderful website, which is online. You can go and see, and they continue to track it and keep it up to date. It's a terrific resource. So there absolutely is great material out there, but you have to follow the money to know what to believe.
And what about the group that you're very much involved in Washington, the Committee for the Republic, which seems to me one of the only groups out there brave enough to try to counterbalance the immense power of the war machine. You've been on the board for a while. I guess we'll close the discussion by my asking you, what is the committee? Why was it started, and what does it do?
Well, the committee, first of all, it's a citizen-based, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and it was founded in 2003 because of the Iraq invasion and because the people who founded it were outraged, horrified that we were starting an offensive war for which there did not seem to be a basis. So that was the start, and it has continued. What it does essentially is sponsor regular monthly debates and presentations on the military-industrial complex, too big to fail banks, campaign finance, and other sort of challenges to the American Republic. I didn't actually know about the committee until 2015 when I came back to Washington to live here and also to work on the book and getting sort of the message out. And when I learned about it, I immediately found John Henry, who's one of the major forces in the organization, and said, I have a book. I would like to talk to your group if that's possible. And a few months later, he worked it out for me to make a presentation. And I started going to the salons now that I was back in Washington. And then eventually later that year, I can't remember exactly when, I was invited to join the board. It's a group of maybe 24 people, deeply informed, deeply committed to their ideas. But I love the rainbow of political thinking. We have liberals, we have conservatives, Democrats, Republicans. It's a cross current of all the things, except that everybody agrees that the endless wars need to end.
Right.
And we also agree on the ways in which the Constitution and Congress do not operate based on the Constitution, that the war power should be in Congress, not in the president's empire. And also the whole question of the American empire, which is another theme that we work on. Now, since the lockdown, we haven't been able to have our in-person meetings, but we have started to do Zooms. And we have found that we have a larger audience, people coming in from across the country, even from Europe, to listen to the presentation and then be part of a discussion, Q&A follow-up. And then the other thing that's happened thanks to the Zoom is we can take advantage of telling people in advance that a program is going to be about something and go ahead and see a video or a movie. And then we will use that as a basis for discussion. And the way we did that just actually within the last few months was a focus on the documentary Coup 53. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but this is a documentary that actually the Washington Post said was one of the 5 best documentaries of 2020. And what it does is basically tell you the roles that M16 and the CIA played in bringing down the democratically elected prime minister of Iran in 1953. The filmmaker who put the documentary together zoomed in from London for the program. And after our discussion, answered many questions about how he had worked to pull it together. And it was a great program. More recently, we did one built around the documentary Who Killed Lieutenant Van Horn, which is about the helicopter pilot who died when his helicopter crashed and burned in a training accident or mission, I should say. We had the widow of the lieutenant as part of the program, and 2 other women whose husbands died in military accidents. And in all 3 cases, they basically initially were told, oh, pilot error. But when they pushed and pushed and pushed, it turned out that the military eventually backed off from that and agreed that there were design flaws and maintenance issues that had led to these accidents, not pilot error.
Right.
We gave all 3 women Defender of Liberty awards for their continuing to try to get truth out about what had happened. And I should tell you that one of the things we learned from that documentary was the belief that that the Pentagon, among all the other things they seem to do wrong, they take money that's intended for maintenance and channel it over to new weapons. We're going to work on this some more.
Yeah, I watched that award ceremony, and it was enormously moving. The bravery of those widows was really quite inspiring. So the committee does great work, and you do great work, and we're really happy to have had you on today. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Molly.
Thank you.